Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jaway Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. 1958 was a momentous year for the Middle East and the world. It was the year Egypt and Syria formed the short-lived United Arab Republic. It was also the year of the small civil war, or the first civil war, in Lebanon. We saw the establishment of the even shorter-lived Arab Federation between the Hashemite kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan. This was, of course, quickly followed by the Iraqi Revolution, which saw the killing of King Faisal and the rise of Abdul Karim Qasim, as well as a number of other events throughout the region. 1958 is also the year that many of the previous generations in the Middle East remember rather fondly, despite the turmoils that followed it. In this episode, I spoke with Jeffrey Karam, editor of the book The Middle East in 1958, Reimagining a Revolutionary Year. He will introduce himself in a bit, as usual, but I wanted first to make note of something rather obvious. We discussed this topic during a period which is ongoing, of revolutionary upheavals in the world. If you want, you can go back to episode 56, in which I took part alongside other co-writers of the book A Region in Revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia here meaning the Middle East, focusing on Lebanon, Algeria, Iraq, Iran, and Sudan. Indeed, 2019 saw a number of such revolutions and uprisings, in addition to Chile, Hong Kong, Thailand, Myanmar, and so on ever since. I am noting this to emphasize that this conversation is as much about the past as it was about the present. It wasn't strictly a conversation about history, in other words. We made those links explicitly, and Jeffrey explained his own positionality with regards to 1958 and the present moment rather eloquently. So that's it for me, folks. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Thank you for listening, and take care.
Thank you so much, Joey, for doing this and for hosting me on today's episode. So my name is Jeffrey Karam. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the Lebanese American University in Lebanon. And I'm also a non-resident research associate at Harvard University's Middle East Initiative. My research focuses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, U.S.-Middle East relations, and revolutions and counter-revolutions. And I'm happy that today we're going to have the opportunity to chat about a recent book that I edited, contributed a chapter to, about the Middle East in 1958. So thanks again, Joey.
So to sort of anchor our conversation, if that's okay, would you mind telling us a bit about the genesis of this book? How did it come about? How are the chapters picked? Maybe up to you, really. And I would also be curious if you can talk about the archival sources and documents.
That's a great question. Thank you for starting off with that. So the book is a product of many, I would say at least 3 or 4 conversations. And when I say conversations, I'm talking here about dialogues with scholars that ended up contributing chapters to the book, but also a personal interest in learning more about this moment in the political history of the modern Middle East. Being a political scientist myself and wanting to understand the present and what we can in some way understand about future trends, I really wanted to dig deep and be able to think more about this moment that older generations, including my parents, my in-laws, and others, constantly remember, even though one would say that the most important part of Lebanon's history, if I'm not only talking about the Middle East, really has to do with the Second Civil War. So it was intriguing growing up in Lebanon to think and to learn and to hear about whether 1958 was a revolution, whether 1958 was a small, short civil war, whether 1958 was only about US intervention. So the story begins with thinking about Lebanon. And as I was working on my dissertation, it became very clear that that moment is really a regional one and even a global one. So, if you want, the intellectual trajectory for this book began in 2013. And at that point, I was conducting research in different capitals in the Middle East on and for my dissertation. And then through contacting different scholars that had already published articles or published books about 1958, it became very clear that there is a missing gap in existing work that we have. And that missing gap was really bringing into conversation Arab states, non-Arab states, and thinking about the reversed logics of whether this was a revolutionary year for states in the Middle East and North Africa, or whether it had implications that also mattered for what we call in the field of international relations, great powers. And the only way for us to be able to do that, and going back to your very important segment and the question regarding archives, was really coming to terms with, in some cases, it's going to be very difficult to find something new to write about. Like, the archives have been there for a while, many scholars have written about them, but in many cases, it was really complicating the bigger story and being able to think along these levels of analysis, connecting the local to the regional to the global, to be able to make a clear, revised interpretation of what makes this year revolutionary, and not only by thinking about it in terms of binary terms, right? Not really thinking about it in terms of whether this was successful for different states or whether this was an epic failure. By nuancing what we mean by success and failure and thinking about revolutions as processes, it became very important that we need to begin from memoirs, we need to begin from archival documents, whether they're state archives, whether they're personal records, to be able to tell a new story. And some of the chapters, and I'll be happy to talk more about that in other questions, are really breaking new ground on sources that are mostly in Arabic or in French, that have been exposed but really have not received sustained attention in the major presses or in different publishing houses. And in other instances, this was really thinking about what and how can we complicate the term and definition of revolutionary. So all the scholars that have contributed chapters had to come to an internal realization, and that had to be really stressed. And it came to the fore in their actual chapters to demonstrate that in many cases, just the idea of some reform or the idea of the possibility of change, if you're taking that within its own context, it is very revolutionary for a particular state at that time. While if you compare it by zooming out and thinking about it from the perspective of America, the perspective of Britain, the perspective of France, you get the different story of the kind of reappraisal, the shift in strategy, the shift in thinking when it comes to their own position and relationship with other states in the region. So, just to sum up and wrap up for this question, it's important, as we've done in the book, to really be clear that these sources have been there for a while. But what's important is really to reread, re-examine, revisit what these sources tell us about the Middle East and North Africa, not in terms of only thinking about it as a region, but being able to complicate it and think about other struggles, other processes that were happening not only in the Middle East, but also happening elsewhere. The book does not tackle these by drawing comparisons to what was happening in other parts and other regions of the world. But at the heart of it, we are all cognizant of the fact that this is not an exceptional moment in the region when we're talking about decolonization or when we're talking about the possibilities of state formation, the possibilities of development, and the response to them. So thinking about these processes and counter strategies, counter revolutions is really the subject matter of why the book is titled Reimagining a Revolutionary Year, because we're trying to understand all the scope, the limits of what happened in that year, and why is it important to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Reimagining is very much a is definitely one of the themes of this podcast, and one of the things that I've personally been curious about with regards to that year. I mean, I study post-war Lebanon mostly, which means that the civil war, like said, the 70s and 80s are one of like the background to that era, obviously being the war era. But 1958 was the background to that background in many ways, and I I have heard it said, and I've read it in multiple places, including this book, that like in 1958 was really a year that saw a real internalization of the region, right? And I'll just preface this by saying that to kind of complicate even that idea a bit more, that in many ways the very notion, like as in in many ways the notion of foreign influence, in quotations, in the Middle East is as old as the very notion of a Middle East. And even if we stick to the, by the standards of the 50s, the then recent past, the fall of the Ottoman Empire wasn't that long ago before that. The French and British mandates, obviously, the establishment of the State of Israel, obviously, all of this like within the 3 decades before 1958, right? And so the question about the internalization is one which I would be very curious to hear your thoughts about, and to kind of put it a bit more crudely in some ways, like what was so special about 1958, and what happened for those who don't even know.
That's a great question. So, in a nutshell, one could say that 1958 was a year of possibilities that happened and ones that did not see the light of day. And these possibilities really had to do with the idea, whether we were thinking about it in hindsight or if we're thinking about it in foresight. If we're thinking about it by wearing the hat of people that were at the time, 1958 represented a rupture. It's a critical juncture. It's a moment of change because of the formation of the United Arab Republic. One can go more into details whether both states were equal when it comes to that relationship in terms of forming the union.
And that
The
is
clear
Egypt
answer,
and Syria, right?
Egypt and Syria, exactly. But in a nutshell, it's very clear, as the book demonstrates, and this goes to my colleague Dina Rizet and Fadi Iskir that both wrote about this. When we think about Egypt and Syria, this is not a symmetric playing field when it comes to the question of Arab unity. They both entered this union for different reasons. But if we're talking about this in hindsight, it becomes very clear that both sides had different reasons for wanting to be part of that union, for wanting to create sort of a nationalist slash regional goal when it comes to Arab unity, right? However, what's so important about 1958 really demonstrated that even if one were to think that there was some change in heart and mind on the level of foreign influence, as you mentioned, between quotes, or in terms of an American apprehension or an American view of the region supporting some groups and some states to be able to achieve their own independence. And this is a very important point of tension between the Americans and the British and the French when it comes to self-determination. 58 demonstrated the limits to that kind of idea, the limits to that kind of support, at least from the Western side, and in competition with the Soviets during the Cold War, that the possibilities of having or achieving a regional system or some kind of independent entity that could really challenge or contest Western slash foreign influence was not one that many great powers were willingly wanting to accept. So if one were to think about 58 in one sentence, not only from the perspective of what happened in Iraq in terms of the revolution turned, like the military coup turned revolution in July 1958, or the attempted military coups in Jordan, or even the union between Egypt and Syria, or the slide towards more authoritarianism in Iran, or the clash between the princes in Saudi Arabia. I can go on and talk about examples between Algeria and then thinking about the collapse of the Fourth Republic in France. So 58, in brief, really represents a moment, a very pivotal moment, not only in the region, but also in the region and connections between states and former colonial powers. And what's important about this for our purposes is really to be able to not only complicate what's exceptional about this year and what's transformative about this year, but it's also to take into account and really consider that the possibilities of change were varied. So if we were to adopt a mindset of what made 1958 important, it really comes down to the epic change, even though the change that we saw in Iraq, one could argue that it began as removing the monarchy and then it morphed into the creation of a military dictatorship. And we could make the same argument for all these countries that were under study in the book. But what's important to be able to keep in mind here is that the possibilities of what could have happened, right? Not what happened. The possibilities of thinking about a new political system in Lebanon, right? Because much of the ills, if we want to talk about Lebanon in terms of what led to the crisis in 1958 and the short civil war and American intervention, were many of the same grievances that resurfaced before 1975. Some of the grievances have to do with power sharing, grievances that have to do with notions of corruption, bickering between the political elite. So if you draw these comparisons, one has to be very clear that on a larger scale, we saw the possibility of what does it mean to be able to nationalize one's resources as it happened in Egypt 1956? What does it mean to think about crafting a new system, whether a new system comes through a military coup or not? But the bigger question here that we want to keep in mind is, well, to what extent can you challenge the existing order that great powers have tried to sustain and sustained it through covert action and overt action, through using different institutions, through economic aid, under the larger category of Cold War bickering and a rivalry with the Soviet Union. But when you dig deep into the experiences of people, of institutions, of different groups, of political parties, of different entities across these states, it becomes very clear that this is the starting point, if you want, in the stage of post-colonialism, the stage of decolonization, the stage of state formation that never completely materialized. But one could think about the Suez crisis and the Suez War as really pushing, calling for a change in direction, and 58 sort of being the test of whether that is possible. But also 58 brought about a very clear notion that testing and pushing for a complete detachment from foreign influence or a complete revamping of the existing order is not going to be that easy. And we're still living in one shape or form, if you want to draw a connection to the future and then draw a connection to what happened in 2010 11, and then think about the second wave, becomes very clear that much of the socioeconomic grievances that we're talking about in 1958, whether it's in Algeria, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq or in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia, are very similar. I don't like talking about history being linear or talking about it in a way where one could say that there is a straight line. But we have to be clear that much of the debates regarding development, modernization, and I put these between quotes, obviously, because these are very contentious terms. When you think about development in the region or underdevelopment, when we think about true modernization or not, one has to keep in mind that these were opportunities that were often aborted, not only because these states did not have strong institutions or did not check all the boxes for what it means to have a strong economy or have a middle class. And I'm not going to go into the debates about these, but as you know, if we're going to think about checklists, we need to keep in mind that this is a process that includes more than one entity. Yes, there is local agency when it comes to why did many states slide into dictatorships? Why did they have authoritarian regimes? But also one cannot deny that foreign influence and foreign powers were extremely active in making sure that the status quo doesn't really change or tilt away from what they tried to build and what they tried to maintain after World War I, after World War II, and going through the Cold War.
Yeah, thanks for that. I personally very much see this question of the military dictatorships and the authoritarianism that followed that era, and in many ways we're still in it in different formats, obviously though, as just the same side, or at least the other side of the same coin, being the other side of the coin of these foreign powers, the big games, is the big powers. I mean, as the big powers game or whatever it's called. Sorry, because for me, like
Game of Nations, like the famous
yeah,
Game of Nations, quote unquote. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like I do.
Yeah.
It is very interesting for me to sort of have these like almost speculative fiction sort of genre, and thinking of like how would the United Arab Republic look like if it was even slightly less authoritarian, for example, if it was slightly more balanced out rather than Egypt having this disproportionate impact or what have you. What would have happened if the Americans did not intervene in Lebanon in 58? What would have happened if one side won in Saudi Arabia rather than the other? And, et cetera, et cetera. This is very,
So
very
this is
interesting.
fascinating. No, this is fascinating. I love what you're saying because like these are questions that really matter. Like revisionist thinking that you're talking about in terms of counterfactual thinking. The possibilities of what if are limitless. And I totally agree with you because all of these are missing stories and some scholars have actually tackled them. Like if America did not intervene in Lebanon, there could have been a possibility for the opposition to be able to revamp the political system. But we really are worried about what we mean by the word opposition in this case. And then the same logic applies to Syria and Egypt. And then the same logic applies to Iraq. Like, what if in Iraq they had not been able to succeed with the military coup turned revolution? What if things remained as is? Could have they reinstated the monarchy? Would have been better to have a monarchy than have another coup and then slide into a regime that was authoritarian and was removed. And then right now, if you think how it was removed under occupation, and where are we if you think about Iraq right now after all these years, then you always have to draw these connections and draw these lines. So I really appreciate what you're saying because it touches on the possibilities of what could have been if we just moved some of these parts. I agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I definitely, hopefully, one day will try and get into on a maybe a speculative fiction, maybe something I'm not sure, but to kind of try and imagine in the context of Lebanon, like what would have happened if in '76 the Syrian regime hadn't intervened, and everything that happened since. Because one thing that this does to me, anyway. So I'll use the example of Lebanon because obviously that's the one I know best. But if I ask that question, like, okay, what would have happened if Hafez al-Assad did not intervene in 1976? For me, it's not necessarily that I will find an answer, but it at least allows me that space to remember that what did happen in 1976 wasn't inevitable. It wasn't some kind. This is one of the problems of how we think about history for the most part, at least from my standpoint. There is, as you said, like there is this idea of history essentially being linear, and that comes with a sort of almost like an assumption that whatever we're talking about were facts, are facts, and because they are facts, they would have always become facts, if that makes sense. Like
Exactly.
this has always been the way it would have happened, which obviously is not what is ahistorical in the first place, but it's just not logical. And that's one way that I would personally, or that's one way I have approached even while reading this book, the Middle East in 1958. Reimagining for me is also that is, as you said, not just looking at the ways we can complicate this usually linear timeline, but actually thinking of different possibilities. Like what would have happened if Nasser died in 58? Like this could have happened, it's not impossible. So like what would have happened after, who would have taken over? If it was Sadat, well, what would, I'm just rambling a bit, but it's all of these questions that to me are as interesting, if not much more interesting, than just opening up a kind of encyclopedia style history book and saying, well, this happened on that date and then this happened on that other date, as if these generals and presidents and kings and princes and whatnot were doing everything they did and could have never done anything else differently, could have never even themselves. And it also, when the problems with that linear timeline, let's say, assumes that they knew what they were doing at all times. Assumes that they
Exactly.
had a real plan for like what to do this month of 1958 and that month of 1959, which obviously, as we know from even reading their own memoirs and their own transcripts or the transcript of their conversations, that was clearly not the case.
No, this is exactly accurate, and I really appreciate the fact that you've engaged with the book in such a clear and detailed manner. Because in the introduction, just to share a thought on this fascinating discussion and what you're touching on, we have to keep in mind that the confusion of the moment, right? The confusion of how these processes unfold when we think about calling an uprising, calling a moment of political change a revolution, and what goes into calling it a revolution if we're going to go for metrics of whether it's going to break the system, revamp it, it's going to reform it. I'm not going to go into definitions, but if we think about that particular moment, in hindsight, we are biased, right? We have hindsight clarity. We're able to look at these dots and we're able to connect them and we're able to say that this could have happened and this is how we read it. But again, I am fascinated by what you're touching on, because another possibility that I would like to complicate, because you are thinking about these issues, like what if America decided to widen its scope of intervention? Americans were very committed to this is going to be an operation only in Lebanon in 1958. But there was a lot of pressure from the British and from the French to expand the operation. The French wanted to be on board. The Americans said no. They wanted also to come to Lebanon. The British wanted the Americans to be more active in Iraq and try to reinstall the monarchy. But much of the assessments on the intelligence level and diplomatic level really focus on the fear of an escalation leading to a general war with the Soviet Union, right? And at that point, we're talking about not only the space race, we're talking about Sputnik 1957, but we're also talking about the nuclear arms race. So when we think about that possibility, that was a possibility in 1958 if and the Americans decided to expand their military operations and target Syria. The Soviets were very clear in their signals and in their messages through the UN and elsewhere that this will not be accepted and would lead to the possibility of a general war. And then we saw the same rhetoric happen on the eve of the Ramadan October War in 1973. So if one were to think about the possibilities and going against this notion of linearity, but also more importantly, going against the idea that these are not messy processes, because I really like what you mentioned regarding, yes, in March 1958, we're going to do A, B, and C. And even when we write about Lebanon and when we talk about any of these experiences in 58, the story always begins with the assassination of Nasib al-Matni, right? Mm-hmm. Nasib al-Matni is assassinated, and then the opposition takes to the street at his funeral, and then the skirmishes begin. And we read it in a way, well, it's fascinating to connect the dots. But what about the contention that was happening before? What about the elections in 1957? The rigged elections that America supported, right? Through the CIA, through the US Embassy in Lebanon. And this is open knowledge. Like, there's nothing hidden about this. It's no longer a secret. Mm-hmm. Like, they bankrolled the entire elections. They ensured that Parliament is going to remain very loyal. 2/3 of Parliament was re-elected, and the traditional faces were actually kicked out of Parliament to ensure that the president could stay in office for another term. This is not something we can deny, but when we think about 1958, as if 1958 is separate from 57 or separate from 56 or separate from the revolution, whether it's quote unquote a white revolution, a peaceful one or not in 1952, when we remember against Bashar al-Khoury, or when we think about what happened in 1947 or 48 when it comes to the Nakba. Like, these are all fascinating threads. Like, these are lines that we need to connect, and we are connecting them in hindsight in a clear way. But once you think about them in real time and foresight, this was not available to anyone. And you're totally right when we would say, well, that's a possibility. Nasser dying in 58, what that meant, right? Or Fuad Sheb not being able to be elected in 1958, what could have happened? Would the war extended? Would the Americans have to stay in Lebanon for another few months or maybe more? What did that mean in terms of Egypt and Syria? Were we going to see an active front that's going to become regionalized more than it was at that point in time local? So these are fascinating questions that would push us not only to understand the past, but also as a political scientist, I would say they're also important to understand the present, and more importantly, be able to at least have a better idea on the possibilities of what could have happened and what can we do about them by looking at the past in a more nuanced and, to a certain extent, a deeper way that is not really looking at these records at face value, reading the archives without really digging deep or against the grain, right? You want to read them in a way where you're going to complicate them beyond one ambassador or military officer or the memoir of a free officer in Iraq or the memoir of a politician in Lebanon or someone in Syria or someone in Egypt. once we complicate this discourse and we're able to read between the lines by triangulating information, we can paint a new picture of a very complex moment, not only in the region, but also in the entire globe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I I sometimes try and think about it in the sense that if someone like sitting right here, right now, wants to do a history of the uprisings in 2019, so like specific, if you want to focus on the region like Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, and of course Lebanon, um, like what are certain things that these people would miss because we need, let's say, a bit of distance, 5 more years worth of data accumulation, etc., just to have a different, or at least a more nuanced take on what was happening. At the same time, I think that recording things as they were, which I was trying to do during the uprising in Lebanon, and other people were trying to do in Lebanon, and of course across the region, that has a certain advantage in the sense that, or maybe this goes back a bit to the question of archives, because of course the archives that we're dealing with right now are overwhelming compared to the archives that we have from the 50s. And these debates that were happening in 1958, you mentioned Nassim Mitni's assassination. He, of course, he was working in the as a journalist. I forgot the name of his journal, The Telegraph, I think.
Telegraph, yes.
Yeah. I mean, all of these debates surrounding decolonization, nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, internationalism, post-colonialism, imperialism, anti-imperialism, state formation more broadly, just to list the ones that you yourself wrote down. You argue in the introduction that the events of 1958 should be understood, sorry, with these contexts in mind, and all of these isms that I just mentioned. Can you sort of expand on that?
Sure. So, in brief, I would say that I'm pushing against the idea of exceptionalism, right? I'm complicating the idea that when we're thinking about what was happening in Lebanon, is it really interconnected, or is it in some shape or form related to what's going on in Syria, or what's going on in Iraq, or what's going on in Jordan, or the Revolutionary War in Algeria, or what's happening in France between the Fourth Republic and the Fifth Republic, and the Fourth Republic collapsed in May 1958, or what's happening in America between the Suez War, the complete shift from wanting to support revolutionary Arab nationalists to then basically wanting to contain them, and then at the end of the decade to a closer relationship between Nasser and Eisenhower in America. So when I'm writing about these isms, quote unquote, with all the complexities and problems that one could think about these isms, the goal and the intention was really to debunk what's so special about the Middle East because of this notion of the awakening, quote unquote, the Arab Spring, quote unquote. These are seminal ways of describing events as if societies, different states, we're really like happy with how things were going on, and we're not really energetic or doing nothing about it, right? As if they were very passive and salient, and they're, I mean, passive, but also in a way silent about these grievances and these issues and whether they can actually change or not, right? So by complicating this story and showing these connections beyond these states, and showing how they had an impact on powers outside these states. And then you think about trends happening elsewhere, the non-aligned movement, right? You're thinking about different attempts of groups and societies thinking about alternatives, third ways, right? Thinking about why are we still living, quote unquote, in the post-imperial order? Like, how much have we been able to change these institutions? This debate happened in Lebanon. This debate happened in Syria. This debate happened in Jordan. How are the military propped up? What does it mean to think about these institutions? What does it mean to think about, if we're going to talk later on about like books and important books, like if you read Hisham Safiuddin's book about banking on the state, right? The financial foundations of Lebanon and the banking system. And then you ask yourself, what's happening in 2019? So the question mark is like, why are people having a problem in Lebanon with banks right now? Why do we have an economic crisis? So one way of saying this could be, well, we were having an economic crisis because of these very closely related events that happened in 2012, 2013, 2015. But the longer and the more in-depth answer would be, well, how are these banks propped up in the first place? Why were they propped up in the hands of a few families in Lebanon? Why were they in control of an entire sector? What does this mean to think about the neoliberal order that we've actually tried to sustain without our input, obviously, without our consent, but this sort of post-war recovery in Lebanon, and whether this is going to be sustainable or not? So when we think about these questions and the origins of these questions, right, and the origins of these isms, when it comes to any ism that you can think about in the region, and we're not only talking about Lebanon, and you frame them in how these chapters are in conversation with other trends, you realize that if you drop the pronouns and you think about what happened in 58, and then think about the second wave right now, 2019, in all the countries that you named, or if you think about the experiences in other parts around the world, right? And you drop the pronouns, you don't have to mention anyone from Lebanon, anyone from Syria, and just say, I'm going to replace these names with people from Chile. I'm going to replace these names with people from Iran or from Iraq or from Sudan or from Algeria or from Vietnam. And we can go more and more. We can talk about different parts and countries around the world. Even some of the rhetoric that comes down to thinking about these socioeconomic grievances, the idea of dignity, the idea of wanting to have a better life, the idea of being able to have a state that's supportive, that's not only taxing you and giving nothing in return. This is not something odd or only relevant for people and societies in the Middle East. And we wanted in our chapters to be able, an introduction and the conclusion, not only to complicate this, but be able to show that the response that we've seen in other post-colonial societies, the response that we've seen when there is a genuine resistance to the idea of imperialism and how imperialism recreates itself through different institutions by creating these systems. And in our case, if you're thinking about in Lebanon or in Syria or in elsewhere, the idea of propping up the military, particular sects, particular institutions, right? That this happened and there was no resistance to it. So by framing 1958 as a resistance to a long process of issues that really begin not only in the mandate period or the interwar period, but really earlier than that, the book is pushing and encouraging everyone to be able to say, well, what's happening in 2019 is not disconnected from what happened in 1958. It's not disconnected from what happened even before 1958. However, the result, to a certain extent, has been mixed. One that one could actually say that it could have led to some positive change, but that positive change was never fully materialized. In other cases, one could say, well, maybe things were better back then. And unfortunately, I hear this rhetoric from many colleagues and friends that Iraq before the US occupation and invasion was better than what it is right now. And that's also very problematic, right? What is better in this notion? How do you define better? How can you qualify the quality of life under a brutal regime or the quality of life under foreign occupation? I'm not going to share my own opinion of this because we can talk about this at another point, but the idea is that these are the sort of very binary arguments that I'm pushing against in this book, and my co-authors are also pushing against, not to adopt sort of, it's only about these isms as much as it's about really complicating these myriad of interdependent stories that, if you think about them for a moment, they really demonstrate contestation and the goal of creating a state that is independent, to a certain extent sovereign, and to a certain extent not really controlled by foreign influence. And that's something that one could say is not only found in the Middle East, but could be really found in other places in the global South.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that as well. And I will say, like, when it comes to 2003, for example, I also avoid the whole, like, was it better or not? I mean, one thing that people who tend to argue like that, one thing that I think they don't see, or at least, let's say it's an obvious blind spot, well, obvious to me anyway, is that it inherently requires some kind of adoption of what was the state narrative prior to that specific date. So, in the case of Iraq pre-2003, I think it would, if one says that things were better before then, it automatically requires to sort of ignore all of the deaths and the genocide against the Kurds and the obviously, the repression against Shias, etc., etc. And so
the
that's
war, Iran-Iraq war of 8
exactly.
years, and the use of chemical weapons, and the food for oil program, extreme poverty, corruption, the brutal police state. But then when you think about American occupation and the invasion, you're like, okay, so it's not a matter of lesser of two evils. Like both of them have their own issues and their own problems, and one has to be to a certain extent aware of these dynamics. But it's unfortunate on so many levels, the before and after argument. Yeah.
Yeah, and one way for me to sort of complicate that is to not just respond to these people on their terms, let's say, but to actually complicate it in advance and let them sort of catch up. And
Yeah.
so, the way I would do it, for example, in here, and I will ask you this question about like your study of 1958 as a year, as a concept, because we're sitting here and, you wrote in 2020, but 2020, 2021, etc. And whether this has sort of led you to have a different view on revolutions. You're right that all of the authors agreed that revolutions are neither static events nor moments in time that have a clear beginning and end. I totally agree with that. I think it's important to note here, that the uprisings given the uprisings in the ones that I mentioned, Lebanon, Algeria, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, since 2019, but even like outside of the region, Hong Kong, Chile, now as we're talking, things in Myanmar are pretty horrible, and so on. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a bit too pragmatic, I'm not sure, but if someone's listening to this conversation that we're having right now, and they are teens, early 20s, they sort of have this different experience just due to that fact of age. So, like, what do you think young people in particular need to understand about what happened that year? I'm especially in my mind right now, especially thinking of protesters from Lebanon, Iraq, except again, all of these other places that I've mentioned, but not just protesters. It's just a more like a broader question.
So this is a fascinating question, and one that I'm thinking a lot about it, not only in this book, not only in other work that I'm doing, but also in a volume that a colleague and I are writing, and I'll be talking about more in a bit. But to answer your very interesting question, so I would say one thing that's for all these protesters that you mentioned, and in anywhere in the region and beyond, that these processes take time. It's not really about a binary outcome. If we're going to be preparing ourselves for the idea of success, quick success, that things are going to change overnight, then we're not very clear, or we're in sync with the reality when it comes to why are we still talking in 2021 about the success of the French Revolution, bearing in mind that the French Revolution, if we were to think about it, what was successful about it was eclipsed later on with the reinstatement of the monarchy, right? If you think about that for a moment, one could say, well, that was a small moment that was successful, but if you think about it on a longer scale, it was actually more of an up and down process. So what's important for our purposes is that at the end of the day, if we're thinking about the success of revolutions, there are a handful. If we can use the label success of a revolution, there are a handful. But if we're going to talk about the success of attempts at trying to challenge the status quo, then we're talking here about dozens and dozens and dozens. Despair, right? Short-term goals, desperation, if you're thinking about it in terms of the regime in front of you, or the ability of the regime, regardless of where you are and what your posting address is, the ability of the regime to recreate itself for years and then being able to crack down on any possible change is part of the process and part of the learning curve. So thinking about revolutions and writing many parts of this book while we were experiencing the beginning of the uprising in October 2019, and what we're seeing right now, it was very clear that if we're going to adopt the mindset that this is going to take a year or two and we're going to be done, or it's just going to be a few months and it's done, or it's going to be about thousands of people in the streets and it's done, this is a long game, right? We're in it for a long time. And myself and others that were scholars, and we're all scholars and activists that were in the streets in Lebanon at the beginning, and then decided that we have to put our energies somewhere else, in a way of saying, it's not like we don't want to invest in this anymore, but we realize that many of these battles need to be fought in many other places, and the street is one of them, right? But it's not the only one. So if I were to say, well, what did I learn, and what I think others would be interesting to really learn and understand and know about 1958 was that if you just think about any metric of success, and I don't like this binary of success and failure, but I'm going to use it just for the sake of the argument, right? If we're going to think about any binary, any metric of success right now in 1958, it has to come down to the repetitiveness and the redundancy of different moments that actually, at the end, without anyone knowing, turned in what we right now call the big R or the big revolution. And what they mean by that, I'll give you a small example. If we just look at Iraq in 1958, and that is sort of the golden standard for revolutions that happened in the 50s, and particularly what happened the year of 1958, well, that should not be eclipsed by the fact that there were at least 6, and in some cases 8, and in other testimonies and oral collections like oral documents and oral histories, at least 10 or 12 attempts by the free officers and groups close to the free officers to be able to pull off what they did on the evening of July 13, July 14, 1958. So if you think about that, and these are attempts that began immediately after the Nakba in 1948. So we're talking about a period of 10 years of attempts to try to change the regime. And even though among the very, very first military coups in the region also happened in Iraq, not Syria. And people always tend to say that began in the 40s in Syria, but it has been debunked by many scholars writing about military coups, saying, well, it actually began in Iraq. Even when you think about it from that standpoint, and not to overcomplicate it, but there's an element of time, there's an element of strategy, there's an element of basically the regime is not going to be happy to accept this, right? They're not just going to stay silent and not do anything about it. And I'm not talking about the Lebanese regime only, but I'm talking about any structure that has maintained the status quo. And if we want to complicate this even further, if one were to think about how great powers react, right? Great powers don't like change. If you think about it, they like keeping the status quo as is. So any revisionism, any revisionist actor that's going to try to revamp the status quo will be, to a certain extent, fought or would lead to an alliance by a group of states to bring down that possible revisionist actor. And the same logic applies to states. And all the countries that you mentioned, they're experiencing the same dynamics. Strong street momentum, strong mobilization, the idea that change is possible, the idea that it's going to happen. And it's going to happen by making sure that more bodies are standing in the street, occupying different squares, and showing that there is an alternative. But the real work comes down to what happens after that euphoric moment. What happens after that messy process, right? What happens after that initial moment where people are free to wave flags, are free to spray paint stuff. All that is important, right? And I believe in all expressions, there shouldn't be a textbook definition or a guide for this is how you express your anger or frustration. But the bigger question is, by reading the past, learning from the past, and thinking about the present, and partaking in this important moment in Lebanon. And as we are working, Rima Majid and I, on this volume that we're co-editing, and we're having contributors from scholars and activists and students that were participating in what happened after October 17, 2019 in Lebanon. The one important lesson that I would like to end with for this question really has to do with the element of time, but also the element of organization, right? It's not only time in terms of knowing that this is not going to happen overnight, that this is going to be a long process. There is a long process. And usually when we think about a successful moment in time, we have to think about what happened before it. So we can't think about 2011 in Egypt, for example, without thinking, well, what was happening before 2011? And this is the same logic that should be applied when it comes to time, but also when it comes to organization and what could happen moving forward, right? If we're going to keep on using the same tactics, the same patterns, at some point, and it's not only going to become redundant, but more importantly, if we want to learn from the past, we need also to think about how to diversify our choice of tactics, but more importantly, how to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And much of the contention that's happening really comes down to early elections versus revising the system versus changing the system from within versus creating new political parties, or whether there is an alternative or a genuine alternative. And these are not exceptional. These are debates that are happening elsewhere in the world. And these are debates that will continue to happen. But the idea here is that while these are happening, what should be sort of a way moving forward? And unfortunately, by looking at the past, we have many negative cases, right? And a very few positive cases. And when I'm using negative and positive, I'm talking about, well, the possibilities of what could have happened and what ended up happening. And in some cases, it's good to take stock of these small changes to keep the momentum and to be able to know that this is a long battle. But in many other cases, even these small victories can become eclipsed. And if we think about the August 4 explosion in Lebanon, a very big chunk of people that were thinking that 2019 is going to be important in terms of breaking the cycle, doing something new, creating an alternative, decided to pack up their bags and realize that there's nothing for them to do in this country anymore. And yes, we are focusing a bit on Lebanon more than other states, but there is a fascinating example that not only both of us can relate to, but also I would say that is becoming sort of like Lebanon's very unique, if you want, right now, not only because of myriad of crises, but it's very difficult to think about a country that went through a major uprising and is still going through some shape or form the lost momentum, regained momentum in some parts of the country. In other parts, it's no longer that. A surge in COVID-19 cases, a collapsing health sector, and last but not least, an ever-growing economic crisis and a financial crisis. So if you think about these 4 or 5 elements combined, and then think about the success of what happened in 2019, it's very difficult to be able to see any positive inkling. But with everything that's been going on and the rationing that's happening right now and fears of removing subsidies and the problems that are happening at supermarkets and the surge in COVID cases and the appreciation of the Lebanese pound, there is still hope. And the idea of hope comes with the idea of time, knowing that this is a long battle, and comes with the idea of better organization. So that's how I would sum up how reading the past and thinking right now about the present and moving forward, what are some lessons that I learned that I knew about by reading and writing, but I didn't know about through lived experience. And through lived experience, this has become sort of, I would say, an important way of how we do things. And it's all about time, it's all about organization, it's all about knowing that this is not going to happen overnight. And we need to have the breath for it, the stamina for it, and the momentum for it.
Yeah, this is provoking a number of thoughts in my mind. I really appreciate everything you're saying, and it reminded me of, like, I had a conversation with Fadi Bardawil, that's episode 14 for those listening, to talk about, well, in that specific case, it was about the 1960s Arab New Left and this group called Socialist Lebanon, etc., etc. And one thing we did focus on in our conversation, which was about a year ago, were the similarities and and differences, of course, between what progressive activists in the 60s had to go through, like this, just the realities that they had to deal with, compared to the past decade, let's say, post Arab Spring, and in the case of Lebanon, post 2019, but more generally speaking, the past decade. Another episode, which would be I think the one just before this one, so episode 71 with Elie Darer, director of Waves 98. Was more about, like, the intergenerational anxieties, as we described them, and these cyclical hauntings, which is a term that I use in my own research on that specific topic. The tensions between, not necessarily tensions between generations per se, because that tends to be a bit too simplistic, but just tensions between different experiences that, let's say, our parents had to go through as quote unquote the war generation, compared to what we had to go through as the quote unquote post-war generation. And in many ways, the to kind of use this generational angle, our parents would have grown up in the years following, or even like around the 1958, or at least they would be growing up in the aftermath, at the very least, of that momentous year. And so maybe it's a bit of a repetition, I'm not sure, but maybe you can take advantage to mention the book that you just mentioned with Rima Majid, because I would be very curious to hear about how, given that this was your latest project, Middle East in 1958, how will you then transition, or if that's even the correct term, to talk about 2019?
That's fascinating. I began the introduction right, of this book of the Middle East in 1958 by mentioning what's going on in Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I began the story in 2019 to demonstrate that in reality, even if we're looking at the past, we are not really disconnected from generations before us. I would say, really, because this is a great question. It's a very deep question, and this requires, like, really I would say, a separate episode, or maybe even more,
Yeah.
to be able to draw the connections, because it's fascinating, to be honest. But I will keep my thoughts very brief because I know we are running out of time. So I'll keep them brief for our listeners and for you and I to be able to expand more on this. So it comes down, in my humble opinion, and in terms of thinking about, well, how are things different? You just need to have one conversation with our parents that lived during the war, and have a conversation with how they think about the situation in Lebanon right now, and you'd realize automatically that even if we're going to talk about sort of this repetitive notion of Lebanon is constantly in mode of crisis, that's the only way that we know how to cope. We know how to cope by being constantly in a crisis mode, right? They will tell you that we long to the days of the Civil War. I've heard that so many times in the last few months that that's pushing me, and colleagues are going to be writing this book. And my co-editor and I, my colleague, and who's also a friend, Rima Majid, we were talking about this, right? That this is exceptional. I don't like the word exceptional, but it's exceptional in terms of hearing anyone tell you that bloodshed is better than what we're going through in Lebanon right now.
Yeah.
Bloodshed. Like we had money, quote unquote. There are. If I were to tell you right now, like, what are the 10 bumper stickers sentences that you frequently hear in Lebanon on any daily basis, was like, yes, we had shortages, but with money you could buy anything. In Lebanon, you hear people saying, well, we don't have the money in the first place to buy anything, and if we have the money, there are shortages in fuel, in medicine, in basic food supplies. So this is unprecedented, and I don't like using the word unprecedented very frequently. But in reality, if I want to think about your question, and I don't think it's a repetition of the first one as much as it's really a great segue to be able to expand on, well, how will this book basically be able to connect to the past? This book is connecting to the past by first showing the new book, basically, the Lebanon Uprising of 2019, Voices from the Revolution, which hopefully will be available in mid-2022, is in reality at the heart of it, even though it will not be made explicitly, is a continuation of things that could have avoided, right? Or one could say missed opportunities of reform, of genuine change, right? But they never happened. And they only may happen, right, if certain things change. And to be more clear about this, we are at this crossroad right now. Thinking about this book, writing about this book is very surreal if you think about it from an academic standpoint. Like living in an economic crisis, a complete financial meltdown, COVID-19 cases, post the biggest non-nuclear explosion in the history of the world after August 4, it is surreal to be able to think about a book project. But in reality, my colleagues and I are coping with this genuine moment that brought some euphoria, right? And this is why it's fascinating to think about Fadi Bardawil's book, right? And the title, Revolution and Disenchantment, right? Yeah. And we are living this disenchantment part right now. And this is the same disenchantment part that many lived basically after the post-1958 moment. Not everyone post-1958 were happy with Fuad Sheh becoming president and the new reformist agenda. Not everyone was happy with what happened after the Nexa in 67 and the Cairo Accords in 69 and the slide, if you want, into the war in 1975 and what happened after the war with Ta'if. There are always going to be winners and losers, quote unquote. I don't like this binary rhetoric, but it is a reality of how we can think about social grievances and how we can think about how systems are created and what kind of structures we're living in. And this is not different than what we experienced in 2019 and how we see it in 2021. And I think much of the debates that are going to be coming to the fore in this book are going to be ones that are going to be talking about well, we saw this as an opening, and we saw this to a certain extent as a moment that was really a rupture in how we think about politics of everyday life in Lebanon. And we're not saying that we're defeated, and we're not saying that this has ended, but we're just saying that this is going to take time. And this is similar to the rhetoric that one could read about in the post-1958 moment, and the same rhetoric that one could read about in the post-1979 moment in Iran, right? When many leftists in Iran were kicked out, basically. There is no other term to say this, right? We're repressed, we're removed from power. If you go into their records, and I've had these chats with many colleagues that are writing about the friends and colleagues that are writing about the post-1979 moment in Iran, it becomes very clear that there's always this idea of, well, what could have been different if we had done step A, B, and C? And I'm not going to say that we're all in that right now, or those that are contributing to the book, but I would say that a very big portion of us are not living in Lebanon anymore, have taken down their own personal notes, have lived for many months and weeks in the streets of Lebanon, all across, not only in the capital. And right now they need this taking a step back to better cope with what did they do, how could have things been different, and how can we move forward? And I think it's therapeutic, just to say at least. I don't think I can talk more about just saying that how therapeutic it is to cope with the reality that if your parents are going to say something like, we wish we were still living during the Civil War because things were not as bad, that is problematic and should push us all, not only scholars, activists, practitioners. It doesn't matter where you are or what profession you are. It doesn't matter which class you belong to. What matters is really coming to terms with this question, which is basically, what is the level of desperation that we've come to be able to hear a sentence from that generation that lived under the threat of guns and bombs, not knowing when they might die, not knowing if they're going to be kidnapped or when they're going to be able to come back home, or what is home for the millions of people that fled the country. To say right now that we are at the brink of maybe what may be another war, to say, well, even if that happens, what we're living right now is basically worse than what we had during the war. And that is problematic. And that is on its own a connection between my parents' generation, your parents' generation, our grandparents, and ones before them, that at every single point in their lifetime, they got to that juncture. And they got to that crossroad and they said, well, maybe just a few years and things will get better. This is not happening in Lebanon anymore. And this is why this is different. And this is why the moment from 2019 up until this moment is different than everything that came before it, because you don't see or don't hear that kind of optimism. Of course, if you happen to be living on another planet, right, you would hear people say that we're resilient and we're going to make things better and the phoenix is going to rise again. I have a problem with these sort of coping mechanisms. They're important and people can cope wherever they want. And I don't think there is one right way of coping. But I think we're at a point right now that we need to push and try to really complicate this notion of we're going to get better and it's just a short period of time. No one's going to leave Lebanon alone. All these cliches, and excuse our listeners and you for saying this, but these cliches of that things are just going to get better on their own actually has been completely debunked this time. This time around, it's very hard to be able to say or even think that it's just going to get better by doing A, B, and C. I think we're beyond that, right? It's beyond economic reforms, beyond having new government, beyond having early elections. And it seems that the beginning of what happened in October 2019 is definitely not the end. Maybe it's the first wave, if you want, quote unquote, or the first phase of this long process. But I would say I don't want to forecast or speculate what's going to happen in the future. But by reading about this, writing about this, and being able to talk about the past and reflecting on the past, there is a level of certainty that one could say that all of this is new territory. We haven't been used to something like this before. And this new territory makes it exciting, but also makes it very scary. And our parents and ones before them did go through very uncertain times. No one can deny that. But there was some semblance of continuity, some semblance of certainty, which I think we don't have anymore. And this could make this a thrilling prospect to be living in the unknown and embracing uncertainty and not knowing how things are going to pan out in the next few weeks, next few months, or even next year. or could allow us to basically be to able to think outside the box to a certain extent and be able to say, well, maybe now is the time to reflect on what happened in 2019 by being mindful of the past, but not getting stuck in the past and not getting stuck in the idea that definitely this is going to lead to a civil war. Definitely we need to flee the country. Definitely we need to do A, B, and C. Like we need to also push against these quote unquote chartered path or definite path that we have become accustomed to because we saw earlier generations do. And the idea of exile and the idea of like what happens after uprisings and after revolutions is very important for many scholars to reflect on. And they've written extensively about what happens after that euphoric moment. But in Lebanon, I think we're still there because this euphoric moment was not undercut or came to an end because people no longer want to take the street. It came to the end with the global pandemic. And I would guess, I don't know if you agree, Joey, but I would say here that if we did not have the global pandemic, things would have been different in Lebanon. And when I say different, I'm not saying for the better or for the worse, but if you just think about temporality, and I know that you work on time, we're talking here October, November, December 2019, January 2020, February 2020, March 2020, the world's completely under lockdown, right? So this wasn't the perfect timing for the first phase of what transpired in October 2019, but this is definitely not going to be the last phase. So that's how I would come about thinking about differences between our generation and the one before us. And if you want, even ones that I remember as a kid, recalling stories from World War I and World War II about Lebanon and independence and this sort of myth of things were not that bad and were able to get by. I don't hear that myth anymore, right? I don't hear that anymore at all, unfortunately.
No, for sure. And I mean, I do definitely agree. I personally think that one thing that, at least symbolically, the like global COVID-19 pandemic has shown is just that there's going to be different factors that, especially due to climate change, especially, will be sort of these factors that are very difficult to predict beforehand. Like if we're in the 50s, I'm not saying it was easy to predict, but you could maybe, if you're, analyzing the situation, you might guess what Nasser might do next. You might have some kind of inclination as to what, because these are all like human decisions, and these are all like human context. The new addition in recent, in at least in our era, essentially, some people call it the Anthropocene. I mean, it's a bit problematic to me, but whatever. Is going to give us, for a lack of a better term, different challenges ahead that I think require us to be more experimental, require us to be more open-minded as to what might work and what might not work, just because there will always be a limitation as to how much we can learn from previous events. That being said, it is very important to see what these previous events, like, or how these previous events have developed, because then we can see at the very least, well, this is what they did. This clearly did not work. This might have worked. This definitely did work. And even if it did work, like by what, then we can, of course, quite like complicate that even more and say like, well, okay, it worked, but by what standards do we count this a success and do we count this a failure? I
Mhm.
definitely agree that like October 2019 Lebanon, just to go back to that point, in many ways was a very unlucky timing. We couldn't predict the pandemic that would hit just 4 months later, essentially. But even worse than that, because for me the August blast was, of course, much worse than anything the pandemic could hit could throw towards us.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. Yes, I totally agree.
Could throw towards us, because I mean, and this is something that we know, I mean, we have since learned that has been basically a ticking time bomb for at least a few years now. And this is one of those things where you have these incredibly symbolic, and I hope listeners don't think that because I'm saying symbolic, I'm saying that it doesn't have any actual real life consequences. It absolutely does, but just symbolic in the sense of the imagery that it evokes. Obviously, people thought immediately after the explosion, most people, they probably assumed there was some kind of attack, by Israel or whatever.
Mhm.
And of course, when they saw this mushroom cloud effect, of course, most people, being consumed by the imageries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thought something along the lines of of a nuclear attack or something, or nuclear explosion even, or something along those lines. Except
Mhm.
doesn't, etc., etc. My point is that in the same way as in the immediate aftermath of this explosion, of the August 4th, 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut, in the same way that it evoked all of these images and people reacted in all of these ways, of course, panicking and horror and all of that. But there was also these reactions that I've mentioned a couple of times, including on the previous episode with Eli Darer, on how you had many people, especially of the older generations, that were immediately, quote unquote, trying to fix the houses. And I'm not
Yep.
saying, that was everyone, of course, but there was definitely this instinct, and this is a war era instinct. And I think what this showed to our, not to play on this intergenerational tension too much, but from my standpoint, it really showed that there is something fundamentally broken in the way we are reacting to certain events. And I completely agree with you that, or I will say it this way as well. I really appreciate the fact that there is a book that will come out next year called Lebanon Uprising of 2019, because I
Mhm.
think we really need things that are written in the moment or in the immediate aftermath of the moment. And I'm sure, and I'm sure you're already thinking about it, of like, when will you even decide when to stop? Because by the time that you're in the process of editing or maybe finishing up the chapters or whatnot, who knows what will still be happening in Lebanon. And so
I agree.
there will be
Yeah.
this question as to, okay, well, we're stopping now for the purpose of analyzing this specific period, but we would know, you'll probably mention it in the conclusion, we know that this is an open-ended book essentially, and that something else can be written as an addendum to it, or as a follow-up to it, or.
Definitely, this is going to be the project, and we're thinking a lot about the accompanying website and different multimedia platforms because we know that this is just sort of the beginning of the debate. But there's one thing that I really wanted to highlight as you were mentioning about our coping mechanisms and why I'm against this. Um, I actually, my partner and I, my wife and I, and our friends, we went down to help our friends that actually lost their apartment. Did not, thankfully, are still with us, but did not basically lost their belongings. They just had rented a new apartment facing the port. Okay. So we were cleaning debris and we were peeling glass and helping out in different stations. And I'm not saying this because I want the listeners to know that. I'm just saying it for one simple reason that this has become our automatic response. We are born into this without even knowing about it, right? And we don't accept it. It is our automatic response because we constantly know in the back of our heads that there is no government. We are brought to this world thinking that if we don't do things in our own hands, right, no one's going to do them for us. So the automatic tents, automatic food stations, donations, people like taking their belongings, blankets, pillows, whatever you do, wherever you have, just bring down to Mankhel and Jemaise and the affected areas around them, right? This is something that needs to be sort of not questioned the moment of, but needs to be questioned later on. The moment of this is what we all did. No one thought twice about holding donations, like doing fundraising. I mean, being able to contact family and friends abroad, send all the support that you can. But once you take a step back, you realize how many times have we filled in for the state? How many times have we allowed the status quo to remain as is because we have that drive, because we can't trust anyone, we have to do things in our own hands. Like, why should the government wait for a few days to send in a truck to clear debris, bearing in mind that they heard pulses, right? This is not something that's easy to fathom. This is not something easy just to say, well, yeah, it's fine. Because the person that was going to send in the trucks was waiting for an official contract. Like, he would not move one truck and one, like, anything down to the area that was, I would say, not damage is an understatement, right? Because he did not finalize that contract and did not make sure that he's going to get enough support and funds for his cronies all around him, right?
Mm.
So we took the decision ourselves with our friends, with different groups, and we realized that this is the pattern that we've been doing forever. I remember my grandparents' house when I was a kid, they had all the scotch tape on their windows. They got so tired of replacing the glass, right? And they were so worried because my mom, my dad, my uncles, that they're going to get injured. So they just made it the point that let's just put scotch tape everywhere. And they had this weird assortment of scotch tape, like blue and white and what. So I remember seeing that when I was growing up. saying like, why do they still have this Scotch tape on their glass, right? Because the war idea, the trauma doesn't really escape your mind. In our cases, we also are traumatized by what had happened on August 4, right? But we also try to cope with it by immediately helping out by fixing, cleaning. Like we had broken windows in our apartment, and we repaired them the following day. So we didn't really come to terms with the damage in a way. Thankfully, we were not hurt, but we did not come to terms with the idea that maybe we should have kept that window there broken for 3 days to remember what the government did to us, right? This is not something that happened out of the blue, as you mentioned. This was a ticking bomb. There are other ticking bombs in Lebanon right now. We don't need Israeli leaders or anyone or any other source in the world to tell us and show us the map of where they are. But the mere fact that this was something that was stationed in the heart of the capital for at least 6 years begs the question that I'm pretty sure that we have other ticking bombs elsewhere. But the idea was that we did not cope with it and come to terms with that when this was written everywhere, right? The government did this to me. My government did this to me, right? It was blasted everywhere, and we did walk on the vigil on August 8th, right? And we were tear gassed the moment that we entered into Martyr Square. That makes you think a lot about COVID-19 being tear gassed while walking in the vigil for hundreds of people that were killed, thousands that were injured and maimed, and thousands that had to flee their businesses, lost their homes, and actually have no source of income whatsoever anymore. And you're being tear gassed by your government that was responsible for, in the first place, leaving that ticking bomb there. So when you think about that and compare it to the war generation, they would tell you, well, our fear was crossing a sniper's nest somewhere, or maybe crossing on the wrong side of the line. And they have their own, I'm not undermining or belittling their horror stories. They're horrible, and we know that, and they're traumatic. And no wonder that many in Lebanon, right, are constantly self-medicating themselves to be able to cope with this reality. But if we're thinking about our generation and what we've seen and what we've experienced, this term of this fake illusion of a post-war Lebanon that is growing and thriving, all these skyscrapers and hotels and investments and tourists and the greatest banking sector in the world all collapsed immediately overnight. Like no one imagined that we're going to wake up in July 2019 knowing that the currency is starting to basically, we could say that, yes, we saw the writing on the wall in terms of an economic crisis is bound to happen. A neoliberal order is bound to produce such a crisis. We can go on using all the scholarly work in the world to be able to say that we should have seen this, right? But in reality, between July and between October, if we're thinking about the wildfires, if we're thinking about banning of the Mashroor Layla concert in Jbel, if we're thinking about all these sectarian comments that were coming out of wildfires in Christian areas and not in Muslim areas, I put this between quotes for our listeners to know that this was a member of parliament that said something like that. If you just dig deep into these smaller stories that were happening before October 2019, and then you fast forward through COVID and the economic crisis, the paper tiger collapsed within moments, right? Because when we were in the street starting on October 17, and then the banks reopened around early November, these 2 weeks were very critical for everything that's happening right now, right? We know what happened from before in terms of the origins of this Ponzi scheme, getting high interest rates. Someone's paying for these interest rates, right? And we know that we're paying for them right now in terms of subsidies, in terms of all the money that was shipped out of the country. But if you think about those very important 2 weeks when people were in the street, building camps, when we were going from one square to another, what was the government doing, right? The government was playing exactly what they do best, allowing people to vent off, allowing people to be able to take to the streets, to be able to express their anger. And once things were put into motion, and when I say put into motion in terms of coming back to terms where there is no capital control, but there is capital control. There is no law for it, but they're actually doing it. And you think about all those small tweaks leading up to COVID, and then you think about COVID, and then you get to August 4, it's like one of those horror films that you watch, and every time you say it's going to end, it's still not going to end, right? There's still another scene lurking somewhere, or as if you saw the credits of the film, and then there's like a hidden scene that's going to entice you to see the following film that's going to come out. I mentioned this because I've been here all this time, and I've lived through these ups and downs. And I can tell you right now that what you touched on in terms of cleaning and the horror show that was really after August 4, it has eclipsed COVID-19. It has eclipsed to a certain extent what happened in October in terms of that beautiful, inspiring moment to one where your government can do that to you and still not even apologize, not even if they resigned, it's not really like they resigned, quote unquote, and you'd still be walking, breathing, smelling. And if you drive anywhere in Beirut right now, it's not only a ghost town, but you also still see broken glass in many places, and you still see places that are under construction that are being fixed, but people don't have the money to do it. You see many houses that have plastic instead of windows. So this is like a constant reminder of how bad things were, how bad things are, and maybe I would say, I hope I'm wrong, maybe the worst that might still happen to unravel in the next few weeks or next few months. Hopefully not. I want to be wrong. But so far, every time, and we were talking about this before the episode, that every time we would say that this is rock bottom, you're reminded that this is not rock bottom, right? That there's more to it. And unfortunately, that's how it is.
Yeah, I had mentioned a Russian joke, which I think is probably from the Soviet times, but it just says we thought we had hit rock bottom, and then someone knocked from below, and it's a reference to the Putin regime especially, but I think it has older connotations in Russia and the Soviet Union.
Yes, yes.
So okay, so let's get into the book section if you don't mind. I know that you probably have a billion books to recommend, but can we start with 3 books for our listeners and just say why these 3 as a sort of conclusion?
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. This is fascinating. So there are books that I'm going to recommend that I really think are really important, and others that I'm going to recommend that I haven't had the chance to read, but I want to share with you sort of like what's on the horizon. So I'm going to begin with Amy Holmes, Coups and Revolutions. We're talking here about mass mobilization, the Egyptian military and the US from Mubarak to Sisi. The book, Amy's book, came out in 2019 by Oxford University Press. It's a fascinating book that really contextualizes how we think about revolutions and counter-revolutions, but also the heart of the book, the gist of the book, really focuses on the role of the military and whether the military really defected and how can they understand defection per se when we're thinking about Egypt between 2011, if you want, and moving forward to the Sisi regime. Another important book that came out in summer of 2020 is by Robert Vitalis, Oilcraft, the Myth of Scarcity and Security That Haunt US Energy Policy. So I've had the chance to, I'm right now writing an introduction and co-editing a series of reviews for HT Plo on Professor Vitalis's book. And it's a fascinating book that actually takes to the heart the idea of the oil crisis and what do we mean by crisis and the bigger idea of oil for security that has been and remains a cornerstone in American foreign policy in the Middle East. It's sort of debunking and really qualifying the oil for security argument between Saudi Arabia and America, and what does that entail? And I think it's fascinating for any person interested in learning more about oil, thinking about US foreign policy, and thinking about what he uses in a very smart way, the title Oilcraft, as if it's witchcraft, if you want, like this idea of a curse that's there that we need to debunk and need to be thinking about. Fadi Badawil's book, we've mentioned it so many times, and you have an episode on it, so I'm not going to go into detail about it. This is a wonderful book as well for the obvious reasons that we mentioned in terms of how we think about revolutions and when we think about disenchantment and what does it mean to be able to think about mobilization and how to write about it. This is a fascinating book on so many levels. In terms of books that I want to read, right, that are in progress, that I've had the chance to read in draft, like I received a few chapters, or I had the chance to chat with a colleague about them, or attend a book event before the actual book is published, there's Hanan Toukan's book, The Politics of Art, Dissent and Cultural Diplomacy in Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. I'm really looking forward to that. That book is coming out in June by Stanford University Press. I've had the chance to read a bit about the book. I haven't read it yet, so I can't make a judgment, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a book that should be on everyone's radar, especially listeners that actually tune into your episodes, Joey. There's also Brandon Wolf Honeycutt's book, The Paranoid Style of American Diplomacy, Oil and Arab Nationalism in Iraq. So I've had the chance, Brandon is a colleague and a friend, I've had the chance to read the book in draft form. And it's a fantastic book on Iraq, American foreign policy, and the debate on oil, thinking about the 50s and the 60s, and even moving forward to thinking about the post-war era. He's a historian, but the book is fascinating to be able to also think about what he calls, in a very smart way, the paranoid style of American diplomacy. There's also Dylan Bond's book, Winning Lebanon. I haven't had the chance to read that, but it's in my pipeline. I really want to read that book, talking about what the period between 1920 and 1958, youth mobilization and populism. That's something also that I want to keep out there on the radar. And some of the books that we mentioned in our conversation, like Hisham's book from 2019, Hisham Safiuddin, Banking on the State, The Financial Foundations of Lebanon. For those listeners that are really interested in learning about Lebanon and the bank crisis and what's going on, it's fascinating to like the timing of Hisham's book. And this goes back to your point, Joey, earlier. No one can predict these things, right? But the timing of the book coming out in 2019 by Stanford, and then thinking about Lebanon and everything that resurfaced when it comes to the banking sector and the crises, it's very illustrative to be able to read from the past and understand, like, as if this Ponzi scheme was always in the making, as if it was there, it was going to explode at some point, and just happened to explode in the same year that the book came out. So I'm pretty sure that Hisham was not planning for this. Obviously, no one's planning for this. But these are some of the books. There are many other that I'm reading in terms of novels. There are books as well in Arabic. There's a great book that just came out about domestic spying in Lebanon, and looks at the Farid Shihab papers and uses them as a source. It talks about 1958, obviously, as one of the most important periods when all this domestic spying was occurring through phones. And there are other Arabic books that I can talk about. But I'm going to keep it at there because I violated your rule of 3 books and I actually spoke about 8. but in reality, it's like there are so many good things happening out there. And bearing in mind that we have limited access in Lebanon to get any of this right now. So it's happening through friends sending you copies or sending you ebooks, because there is a cap on our credit cards and our ability to be able to bring books, even if you, just for the sake of the episode and for your listeners to know, my book is not available in Lebanon, right? It's too expensive for a bookstore to buy. So far they haven't been able to bring it to Lebanon. So just imagine that for a moment. Like, it's a book about Lebanon, about Iraq, about Iran, about the Middle East and North Africa. It talks about America. It's really like regional, global, and international. It doesn't really focus on one particular country. And it is, I would say, to a certain extent, hopefully it will become an essential reading for any individual that wants to learn more about this period and how it connects to the present. But you can't really tell anyone, this book is available at that bookstore or that bookstore. So all the books that I mentioned are ones that I've either had purchased through ebooks, or I have like a hard copy, but it's not one that I was able to get in Lebanon, one that I had to get while I was traveling, or a friend or family relative coming from abroad. And even with that, it's still fascinating to be able to stay informed of these books and share them with you and your listeners.
No, thanks for that. And I mean, if people break the rules just to recommend more books, I'm not going to complain about it. Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, I'm doing my research on Lebanon, as you know, and it's been very difficult for me to even get certain things in recent days. I had to rely on a few relatives traveling from time to time, or, that sort of thing, which is not very stable. It is what it is. I suppose that, like, there isn't much that can be done about it. And I do rely on ebooks when I can as well, even though I don't really like them. But I mean, Jeffrey, on that note, thank you a lot for all of this. This has been really, really fascinating. Thanks a lot for the billion books. Thanks a lot for the nuanced discussion that we just had. And I would love to stay in touch, and I'm sure we can have different discussions at a later date as well.
I would love that as well. Thank you so much, Joey, for this and for everything that you're doing really with this platform. It's amazing. The guests are it's spectacular. The discussion, the quality of the questions, and I really encourage really any of my colleagues that are listening to this or friends that are listening to this to reach out to you and be able to set up something similar, because it's always good to take a step back and be able to connect and talk about different themes, issues that cut across not only our books or articles or research, but also from a more practical standpoint. And I know that you've had Taimur several times, Taimur is also a friend, to talk about what's going on in Lebanon, but it's really a great platform. And I really encourage everyone listening to not only stay tuned for other episodes, but also these recommendations that I mentioned right now are also maybe very intriguing scholars that we'd like to maybe invite as well to be able to have these very deep conversations. So thank you again for doing this and for inviting me.
Absolutely. I will briefly say that I'm going to have Timur again at some point, Timur Azhari, for those who don't know, and Lina Munzer on actually together to speak about the legacy of the Great Famine. That should be an interesting episode as well.
Looking forward to that. That's wonderful.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.